Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Film Scores. So this is a patron requested video requested by patron Ricky. Ricky, thanks so much for your request. In this video I will count down my top 10 favorite orchestral or instrumental scores from my favorite films. So this is different than, say, collection of songs like rock or pop songs or whatever it may be that happen to be on the film's soundtrack. I'm only going to look at the instrumental orchestral, or sometimes not always orchestral, but the instrumental score that strengthens the film. And so one very important disclaimer I had to give to begin with is that this video will not feature any of the music. You can go, if you're curious about a soundtrack that I mentioned, you can go look it up on YouTube. I'm sure they have the film scores there. YouTube is just very strict about using music in your videos, and I don't want to risk it. And plus, it's very time consuming. And so this will just be me talking about the film scores. They will not feature any samples. Just letting you know up front if you're expecting that. But you, of course, as I said, you can check out, do a Google search and you can find these soundtracks readily available on YouTube, I'm sure. Anyway, the other thing I will say about this top 10 is my own personal opinion. It doesn't necessarily line up with popular opinion. And most of the film scores that I will have on here are from my favorite films. Now, this list would be very different than, say, if I did a list of my favorite movies. Because I'm not judging on how good the movie is. The metric I'm really using for this top 10 is how much does the music enhance my enjoyment of this film? How much does the music really speak to me personally? How much do I often think about when I think of the movie? One of the first things I think about is, yeah, that music is amazing, or the music makes it so much better, or the music, really enhances, or do I want to go out and buy a soundtrack and listen to this music on my free time because it's so good and it touches me emotionally just listening to the music. So those are the sort of things I was considering, but I do tend to favor the movies that I really like, because if I don't really like a movie that much, or it doesn't really stick up on my mind that much, or I think it's kind of mediocre, or if I don't like it, then the music I'm not really going to care about how good the music is, because I'm not going to have that association of enhancing a great story. But that's just me. So anyway, let me go ahead and get started. And I'll start with a few honorable mentions. The first honorable mention is Donnie Darko. Composer is Michael Andre. Donnie Darko's very subtle music. It just barely made my honorable mentions because I can't consider the 80s soundtrack, which is great. But as I said, I'm not considering the songs in it, just the score. And the score is really subtle, but it does do a good job of getting you into the mind-bendy tone of the film. So next honorable mention is 12 Monkeys. Composer is Paul Buckmaster. Now 12 Monkeys isn't the kind of score I'd like to listen to on my free time. It's accordion music, but it works perfect for the film to get you into the crazy, weird mindset of a film that explores what it is like to be insane and questions whether or not you are insane. So I think it's perfect. But really, the violin music and the emotional parts of the film, they do bring a tear to my eye. They are extremely effective, so that's why I had to put this as an honorable mention. And my final honorable mention is Total Recall. Composer is Jerry Goldsmith, who's a well-known composer, and this is the only film of his that I had on my list. But anyway, this is a very good I actually considered this with two other Arnold films, Predator and Terminator 2, and this was actually my favorite out of the three, and the other two didn't quite make my honorable mentions. They were almost going to, but this one does, because it's not just the opening theme, which is really great and exciting, gets you ready. It's the music throughout the film that gets you to question reality. I think it does a really good job, and it's just a good score. So next, we will get into my top 10, and we'll start with my number 10. which is Inception by Hans Zimmer. So this is one of the many collaborations between Hans Zimmer and Christopher Nolan, and this is one of the most impressive ones in my opinion. Again, it has the mind-bending dreamscape. It does that very well, and of course it plays into the suspense scenes. I think the final piece that's towards the end of the film, called Time, is one of the most popular search pieces, and this is actually a score I've seen on many other people's top 10 lists, and I actually agree with them on this one. I think this one was quite good. So next we will get into my number 9, which is Lost Highway, composers Trent Reznor and Angelo Badalamenti, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not. Now, Angelo Badalamenti collaborated with David Lynch on several other projects. He's mainly a jazz singer, or player, I should say. I think mainly plays the sax, if I'm not too mistaken. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But he worked with David Lynch on Twin Peaks. But it was Trent Reznor that composed the soundtrack for the film. Like the collection of songs and whatnot, but he also did a couple of pieces, original pieces for the background score, which is why I consider it a score and not just a collection of songs. But he did do Perfect Drug for this film, but I'm not considering that because I'm only looking at the score side of thing. And Trent Reznor had done more recent stuff, like the Social Network and whatnot, but I thought No Social Network was mediocre. So as I said, mediocre films don't affect me that much. This one, Lost Highway, has always been one of my favorite films, and is mainly because of the music in it. Now, granted, this would be much higher on my list if I was considering the songs that are on the soundtrack. In fact, it would probably be my number 1, if I'm being honest. I think this is probably the best collection of songs, soundtrack of any film, because it works for the film, but I'm not considering that. I'm just considering the music. But Trent Reznor has a piece called Driver Down, which I think is freaking amazing, that they play at the end of the film when the main character is in a highway chase scene, and it just so enhances the film and enhances the strangeness and weirdness. And I love freaking Angelo Badalamenti's jazz pieces as well. Like those are really intense and enhance the film. So this is probably my favorite movie for music, period. But as I said, I'm not considering the song, so that's why it comes in at number 9 instead of number 1. Anyway, we will get into my number 8, which is Braveheart by James Horner. I know a lot of people don't like this film because it's very historically inaccurate, but I've always liked it. I didn't care about that. I thought that the story they were telling, I just look at it as a fictional film. Like, the story that they tell is very good, very well done, and the music, it definitely enhances that a lot. This is a soundtrack that I had as a teenager, and I used to listen to it repeatedly all the time because it really got me in the feels. I had the soft Celtic music, but then it got really inspiring when it really wanted to. So yeah, always loved Braveheart. So next we will get into my number 7, which is Aliens, which is the composer is once again James Horner. So yes, he's appearing 2 times in a row. And Aliens, talking about the second one, obviously, is one of my favorite films of all time, and the music does really enhance it, particularly when we get towards the end of the film, when we get into the really suspenseful moment when Ridley faces off against the alien queen, and that music that they play is just so intense and just so really, really gets to me personally, and enhances the film. And I do think the film would not be as powerful without that great music. So next we will get into my number 6, which is Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock. Composer, as you guessed it, James Horner. That's a 3 times in a row. So you can see how much I do like James Horner as a composer. Now the funny thing, now Star Trek 3, the soundtrack was very similar to Star Trek 2. And it almost could be considered the same. There's slight variations, and so when I was thinking of which one I prefer out of the two, I have to go with Star Trek 3 because I think there's slight variation. Star Trek 2 is more sort of naval, adventure, battle-like, whereas Star Trek 3 gets into the more emotional side, and that's actually what I gravitate to more, but that's just splitting hairs because I love both soundtracks. I just wouldn't put them both on here because that's repetitive, but I am being a little bit repetitive because James Horner's score for Aliens was actually extremely similar to Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. In fact, some people noted that it's because he was given so little time to work on the soundtrack that he just redid what he did for Star Trek, but changed it slightly. But I think they're changed because you can definitely tell like strong similarities between them, but I think he changed it enough to make it its own unique thing, which is why I still put it on there, as well as Star Trek 3, which is definitely different. But it's particularly the opening score over the opening credits was I think one of the most beautiful pieces in film history, and this is mainly why I loved those two films so much, was because of the score. Star Trek 2 and 3, that is. So yeah, that has to be on here. But that's it for James Horner. Actually, some people, including Ricky, who requested this video, really loved the Titanic soundtrack. That was on a lot of lists that I saw, and that was James Horner. But I actually prefer these 3 soundtracks to Titanic, mainly because I never liked that movie. And as I said, for me personally, the movie has to be really good for me to really love the soundtrack. Anyway, so next we'll get into my top 5, and we'll start with my number 5, which is Starman. Composer is Jack Nitzsche. I'm sorry, I know I mispronounced that. I did try my best. It's Nitzsche. So Starman is one of those films, those niche films from the 80s that most people hadn't heard of. Now, it was a lot of John Carpenter fans, of course, and heard of this film and like it because it's one of the films he made. I personally, it's the only John Carpenter film that I really like, honestly, because I don't really care for horror films, so I don't care for all of his horror films. This wasn't a horror film. This was a romance sci-fi, so very outside his wheelhouse, and it's something that Jeff Bridges, who stars in this film, really loved this film as well, and he had a lot of good things to say about it during the audio commentary that he recorded several decades after this film was released. Now, this was always one of my favorite films growing up as a teenager. I had this on VHS. We recorded it off of cable on the TV, and I used to watch it repeatedly, and it would always bring a tear to my eye, and a lot of that had to do with the soundtrack. I think the music is something that always stuck with me. In fact, on occasion, I'll go onto YouTube and just search for the main theme of this film and just listen to it and shed a few tears because it makes me think of the emotional state of the film with this alien who takes the form of this woman's dead husband and sort of forms a little bit of a romance with her, but it's not her husband, but it kind of is, and it's I don't know. You have to see the film. It's really touching, and the music it's just drives home. And again, it has that 80s synth score to it, but it just works. It just really works, and I do like to listen to this song from time to time. So next, I'll get into my number 4, which is Cloud Atlas. Composers are Tom Tykwer, Johnny Kilmick, and Reinhold Hill, if I'm pronouncing those correctly. So Cloud Atlas is a film that most people think is not very good, or kind of a B movie, a forgettable movie, but I think it has a little bit of a cult following. I remember I named this one of my favorite movies of all time, and I got comments saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous. I totally disregard your opinion because you would have the nerve to say that." The movie has some flaws, for sure. And so at one point I had it as my second favorite movie of all time, but I dropped that a bit since then. I think on my channel it still shows up as number 2, but I've changed my mind about that. It's maybe still in my top 10, but maybe more like a top 20 material. But I was just listening to, because I would listen to the scores while I was making this top 10 to just reaffirm like where exactly I would hit this. And I wouldn't expect to put the soundtrack so high, but as soon as I listened to it, like I almost started crying immediately. Like the soundtrack has a lot, and a whole lot to do with why I like this movie so much to begin with, and why I can't believe why people don't like this movie that much, because the soundtrack is just so goddamn good, and it just really like especially the emotional moments and how it relates to all these different genres, because this movie has like 6 different genres that are happening at the same time, yet the music is very universal and relates to all of them and binds them all together. It's like the binding tape that binds them all together, really, and it's just so damn good. I'm sorry, I love this soundtrack. So next, we'll get into my number 3, going with something classic, a more fan favorite. This is a soundtrack I did see on a lot of people's, towards the top of a lot of people's lists, and that is, of course, Star Wars. And to represent Star Wars, I went with Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. The composer is John Williams. And so, yeah, I chose Empire Strikes Back particularly over, say, A New Hope, because it has the Imperial March, which I think is it's one of the pieces of music that I love to hear the most. I always hum to myself. And then, of course, it has lots of other memorable pieces, such as the asteroid field piece, and then, Yoda's theme and stuff like that. So, yeah, Star Wars, of course, has amazing music. But I think Empire Strikes Back was its masterpiece. And it's really mystical. Everyone points to sort of John Williams as kind of a genius composer. You do have Duel of the Fates, which was in the prequels, but I still think it doesn't hold a candle to what they did in Empire. So yeah, that is my pick for number 3. So now we will get into my number 2, which is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Composer is Howard Shore. So this time I did kind of cop out and chose the entire trilogy, but these films were made back to back to back to back. So I think personally it would be ridiculous to point out one of them. They're all good. They do have different themes. Like the first one focuses more on the Fellowship theme. The second one has the Rohirrim theme and Gollum's theme. And then the third one focuses more on Gondor's theme and the Nazgul's theme. But yeah, the score for all these movies is just amazing. You talk about the Nazgul when they're hunting out of Frodo, and when those Arwen comes and those water horses come. Like the music so enhances these suspense scenes, which would be nothing without the music. Not to mention the beautiful finale of Return of the King, when Frodo goes to Mount Doom. That whole score, it just soars and sells the epicness of the moment. The music is what makes this trilogy so epic. So yeah, that is very nearly my number 1. In fact, sometimes I still think maybe I should have had this at my number 1. And it was really close between my number 1 and number 2. But for my number 1, I decided to go with Interstellar by Hans Zimmer. I remember describing once the theater experience that I had with Interstellar, where when the film ended, I was like stuck. I was like glued to my seat in the movie theater, and I couldn't get up. I was like paralyzed. I was so stunned and blown away with what I just saw, and I'm sorry. At least 50% of that had to do with the music. Really, I mean, I love Interstellar. It's one of my favorite movies. I don't think it would quite make my top 10, maybe my top 25. But I still, like, that's still high praise, like movies of all time. I still love this movie. I just wouldn't put it in my top 10 favorite movies. But the score was so goddamn good. This is something, sometimes I'll go and just watch particular scenes from this film just so I can hear the music. Now, so I could go on YouTube and look up the music and just listen to it, but it's more effective, like, seeing the scene that the music goes with and the adventure, but it's the music itself that enhances the scene. I'm thinking in particular of two scenes. I honestly go and watch these scenes like by themselves occasionally, like a whole bunch of times, without watching the entire film. The scene where he's on when they're on the planet with the water and they think it's mountains, but it's actually waves. A fucking amazing scene. And the other one is the scene where they're trying to dock the ship after the station is like spinning out of control, and they say, "Oh, it's impossible." He's like, "No, it's necessary." And the music is so fucking good. Like, it gives me goosebumps just listening to that music every single time that I listen to it. And it's not just that. Throughout the film, a lot of people complained that the music was too loud and interfered with, you know, the movie itself, and you couldn't hear anything else. But I don't want to hear anything else. The music is so fucking good. Like, glad it's loud. It's so good. So I had to go with that. As I said, it's a very close tie, like run up. I'd almost call it a tie with Lord of the Rings, but still slightly went with this one just because of the theatrical experience I had with this. And also, by the way, this is the one movie where when I do watch it or when I do listen to the score, I really have to crank up the music. It's so much better the louder it goes. Usually I put the headphones on so I don't disturb other people, but just crank up that fucking music because it's so goddamn good. Anyway, that's my top 10 favorite film scores of all time. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many other science fiction projects, mainly doing Star Trek. At the moment, covering Star Trek Next Generation Season 3. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.